thank you very much for joining us. A number of colleagues have actually flown in, I could say, for this meeting. That would be more or less true, but not entirely, but for a series of meetings. So particularly welcome those who got off an aeroplane this morning to be with us here in London. And big welcome to those who are joining online as well. It's your event as much as it is an event for all of us here in the room together at ODI. So welcome. My name's Sam Bickersteth, and I'm the Chief Executive of CDKN, and this is a collaborative event, seminar, workshop, call it what you will, seminar I think, together with ODI, and I'm very grateful for the partnership with ODI that we've had around climate-compatible development and the Paris actions over the last few years. And this paper is the culmination of quite a lot of analysis and thinking about where we are with the core of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and that is the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. Mainstreaming climate-compatible development is the title of a new CDKN book, and I shouldn't encourage it to be on your bookshelf, but it should be in your e-book shelf. It's available on our website, and the word I want to emphasize there is mainstreaming. The NDCs really emerge, as I mentioned, as the principal mechanism for implementation of the Paris Agreement, and they will only work if they are mainstreamed or integrated into national development planning, budgeting, and implementation. And I emphasize it's not just the planning, it's actually moving from the rhetoric to the reality. And as you know, it's a hard ask to move from signing up at international level in the momentum of the Paris Agreement, and then the ratification which followed 10 months, 9 months later, and then actually doing stuff at national level on the ground with actors, municipalities, businesses, budgets, communities, and sectors. Well, this paper, which is going to be presented by colleagues from ODI and the CDKN teams today, draws on a framework which ODI has evolved over the last few years to think about these issues of implementing climate actions, and test this against 7 countries from the set of countries in which CDKN has been working. And it offers some propositions around this integration, or we could say mainstreaming challenge of the NDCs, because the NDCs are not going to work if they're stuck in a box and seen as belonging just in the Ministry of Climate Change or Environment. It's about how they sit through the whole economic and social implementation of governments and other stakeholders. So that's what we're going to discuss today. And in terms of the format here, Neil Bird, who's from the Home Team, who's a senior research fellow here in the Climate and Energy Programme, and has been working across the work of ODI and CDKN for the past few years, is going to present these 10 propositions. We're then going to have some commentary from a star lineup of CDKN colleagues. First of all, on my left, Claire Monkhouse, who's just come back from a workshop in Kampala with a number of other countries looking at exactly this issue of implementing and applying a framework on NDC implementation to the real challenges of 4 countries. Claire will speak, followed by Margaret, known as Maggie Kamal, from the CDKN Kenya team, who is with us today to particularly share the experience in Kenya, and welcome to you as well, Maggie. And then finally, Shanaz Musa, my colleague from the CDKN Africa team, who's a director of South-South-North, who works, I mean, you work internationally and across Africa, but is going to particularly pick up on the South Africa aspect and see what's the relevance of this NDC implementation framework in that context. So after their comments, we'll definitely open it to the floor, and by the floor I mean those online. So I would encourage those online to send electronically your questions early. Don't leave it till 1:29 UK time to do that, because it will be too late by that point in time. So we'll leave at least 30 minutes for question and answer session. So that's the plan, and with that I'd like to turn to you, Neil. Now Neil's suffering from a sore throat or some bug, which I think your family's generously shared with you, so you might need the water as you go. Neil, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sam. And yes, my apologies first of all for my voice this afternoon. I seem to have succumbed to a summer cold, as occasionally happens. I'm going to speak to this paper. And this paper examines the extent to which NDC commitments in developing countries are being integrated into national development planning. The paper aims to identify key issues that will support this integration and lead to successful NDC implementation. The approach taken has been to develop a set of 10 propositions related to the effectiveness of 1, the national policy and planning processes, 2, institutional arrangements, and 3, the allocation of public resources, which, if followed, will support the integration of NDCs into national development planning. Of course, such propositions should probably carry a public health warning. They have general but not universal application. They aim to provide a framework that then needs to be tailored according to the unique characteristics of each country. To explore the utility of this approach, we drew on the experience of 7 CDKN country programs in Ethiopia, Bangladesh, India, Kenya, Pakistan, Peru, and Uganda. Our working assumption was that meeting NDC commitments will depend on the national priority they are given, and the integration of NDC actions into national development planning is necessary to secure this recognition, as well as the resources required for implementation. Our first proposition is that NDC should be consistent with national development policies and plans. In all the countries reviewed, it was apparent that the first NDCs had been prepared in knowledge of both the national climate change policy and, crucially, the National Development Plan. We also found that the opportunity for integration appears to be facilitated when the planning cycles of these different processes coincide. However, the link to national development plans presupposes that such plans act as the main expression of government's economic policy. Whilst this remains true in many low-income countries, the centrality of a national plan appears to be diminishing in larger economies, where subnational and sector development plans feature more prominently, as in India and Pakistan. In low-income countries, there is also a case to ensure that NDC proposed actions are set within sector action plans to allow for their early implementation. And this is a theme I know Maggie will come back to later. The second proposition is that NDC should follow smart design principles, because if early action is to be secured, climate change objectives need to be clearly understood by the implementing agencies. So objectives that allow for smart targets to be constructed, those that are specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic and time-bound, for that acronym. It's a well-established approach to establishing clarity over objective setting. Now, all 7 countries listed both mitigation and, equally importantly, adaptation objectives in their first NDCs. However, whilst the mitigation objectives are well defined, allowing for ready integration into national development planning, adaptation objectives continue to be expressed in very broad descriptive terms. It may be that adaptation targets may become clearer as early project experience broadens, highlighting the need to recognize adaptive approaches to objective setting when it comes to adaptation. The third proposition states that NDCs should have broad national support. Now, we found that consultation processes are an established part of public policy development in all these countries. In particular, NDC development has seen two complementary approaches to securing broad national support. First, the establishment of small informed groups of technical experts who can deal with the specialist content. And secondly, larger participatory events that help in awareness raising and, importantly, consensus building. The fourth proposition is that NDC should have strong political backing. The approval of the NDC was made by the Prime Minister or the Cabinet of Government in every country reviewed. And we believe that's a significant result in that it has created awareness at the highest level of government and allows for some consideration of integrating climate change targets into broader national policy and helps to avoid policy conflicts. This may represent a potential benefit of tying national climate change policy to international commitments in that it draws in the head of state and those around him or her. Our fifth proposition is that NDC development should have clear institutional leadership. And there are indications here of an emerging shift in ownership of climate change policy. Whilst ministries of environment are still either leading or being a key player in NDC development, there is greater involvement of other ministries. For example, Peru had a multi-sectoral team to develop the NDC. And in this way, NDC implementation is assisting the integration of climate change into development planning through securing ownership across a number of government ministries. The sixth proposition calls for national coordination for climate change and development actions. And here we found two main approaches to securing coordination in the case study countries. These can be characterized as policy-focused and implementation-focused coordination. For the former, several countries have instigated national climate change councils, often chaired by the head of state. The second approach focuses on securing the involvement and coordination between different ministries as part of the development of specific public investment programs. And for example, this approach has been followed by Ethiopia's Ministry of Finance and Economic Cooperation, to good effect, we believe. The seventh proposition is that NDC institutions should respond to local development needs. National development planning in all 7 countries includes the aim of reducing poverty. One way to secure the integration of NDC commitments with national development planning is therefore for such commitments to recognize the needs of vulnerable groups. With agriculture continuing to dominate poor people's livelihoods in many countries, the developmental co-benefits of rural mitigation strategies can be significant in terms of responding to those local development needs. However, many agricultural development programs depend on local government agencies. Therefore, the extent to which decentralization processes have advanced in a country and capacitated local government agencies is influencing the speed by which NDC commitments can be integrated into local development planning. The 8th proposition is that NDC spending should be part of normal national budget planning. The ease by which NDC actions can be identified in the national budget system is dependent on the budget classification and the funding channels in use. With regards to the former, program-based budgets that classify spending by strategic outcomes raise the possibility of identifying climate change-related public spending. This type of budget classification is now being introduced in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya, for example. With regard to the channels through which public funds flow, the use of national climate funds is an innovation that aims to mobilize additional financial resources, including for NDC implementation. National climate funds have been established in Bangladesh and Ethiopia and are now legislated for in Kenya and Pakistan. The ninth proposition is that NDC spending should be monitored and reported upon. Confidence in the implementation of NDC commitments will rest in part on the necessary financial resources being released each year to support climate change public investments. In each country, records of relevant spending follow the budget process. Therefore, where the end-of-year expenditures can be compared to the start-of-year budget in a consistent manner, the public funding of NDC actions could potentially be tracked. An example of such a system developing, again, coming back always to the great example of Kenya, is Kenya, where annual reporting on government expenditure is now contained in sector medium-term expenditure framework reports. And finally, our 10th proposition is that NDC spending should be subject to national oversight and scrutiny. Interestingly, national parliaments appear to have played a very limited role in the development of nationally determined contributions thus far. In part, this reflects the fact that in the countries reviewed, policy development looks more to the executive rather than the legislative branch of government. However, there is potential for parliaments to play a greater role in NDC implementation, particularly on financing. And this should strengthen national and local accountability systems. So, overall, the evidence we have gathered on integrating climate change commitments, NDC commitments, into national development planning suggests at the present time, first, that the policy and planning framework in the 7 countries examined is generally supportive of mainstreaming climate change actions into broader national development planning. Second, however, there are challenges in securing the institutional effectiveness over the delivery of NDC commitments, often reflecting different capacities across sectors and different levels of government. And finally, and this is sort of always my particular interest because I think it's the weakest link in the chain, the financing of NDCs remains unclear in all the countries reviewed, being dependent to date mostly on national budget allocations, for which there has been limited monitoring of the relevant climate change spending. So on that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. That's it was nearly 1 minute per proposition, so I congratulate you on that. Just a little bit over, and I was sort of thought you'd just use up your extra 4 minutes on the finance, but you were very balanced across the 10. And Neil, as you know, has worked a lot on climate public expenditure and institutional reviews, CPIRs, and so that this draws on that body of learning. But I think it's a good broad assessment that doesn't just focus on the finance side. So thank you very much for that. Claire, you got off a flight from Kampala yesterday or the day before and were meeting with 4 officials from 4 countries and experts from 4 countries, kind of reviewing the state of implementation of the NDCs. And I guess the question is, is this a framework that can help accelerate and move that process forward? Would you like to share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, just as context, CDKN's been supporting the governments of Kenya, Uganda, Zambia and Bangladesh with their kind of early planning for NDC implementation. And the meeting in Kampala last week was to bring those four governments together to quite a small meeting where we could discuss over 2 days kind of early experiences and lessons with planning for NDC implementation. And I think the kind of issues kind of most front of mind for those in the room were around the mandates for coordinating at this stage at the national level, and the challenges around cross-government working and coordination with sectoral ministries, and also coordinating at the subnational level. And I think it was kind of acknowledges that these challenges aren't new. The NDCs as a process and the Paris Agreement are new, but the challenges around climate change mainstreaming aren't. But the NDC provides a kind of new impetus, and there are new requirements that they'll need to respond to. So, I mean, obviously there's 10 propositions, so I won't provide a reflection against all of them, but I think the two key things that stood out for me were around the need for broad national support, so proposition number 3, and then proposition number 9 around, it's actually MRV of finance in the report, but I think MRV more broadly was a key issue for those present. And then as a kind of cross-cutting theme, the need for capacity development to support this whole process. So if I could just take those three points in turn. So proposition number 3 around the need for broad national support. Clearly, we're going to need that in place inside and outside of government, sectoral, national, subnational level, in order to be able to deliver on the commitments that have been made. There were 4 key points that I think emerge around this theme. Firstly, have the right people been involved to date? As Neil said, the INDC process itself was really participative, but now taking a step back after Paris, the people that we spoke to were reflecting on, were they the right people in the room? Have we engaged at the right level within ministries? Are the key stakeholders that actually we should have engaged with, and now we need to sort of reach out? Linked to that, there's a difference between engaging for action and awareness raising. So there is a need for general awareness raising sort of across the country, linked to the need to kind of develop a mandate, I think, for government and others to take action. But also, who are those key stakeholders that actually need to support NDC implementation on the ground? Have we identified who those key stakeholders are yet? And in particular, there was a feeling that there was a need to engage better with the private sector and at the subnational level. In terms of private sector, I think a lot of us often talk about the private sector as if it's a homogenous group, but clearly it isn't. And it's a case, I think, of identifying who is it in the private sector who's really instrumental to supporting implementation on the ground, from your industrial sectors down to your big banks, insurance companies, etc. And for governments, what kind of enabling environment needs to be in place to kind of really mobilise that private sector? In terms of subnational engagement, clearly that a lot will need delivering at the subnational level, and in a number of countries where we work, those subnational arrangements are quite complex, and there's a need to kind of reach out, and I think Maggie may say more about this, but there was a feeling that there was a need to kind of reach out and connect more with the subnational level, and the focus so far has been very much on getting the national coordination in place. I think both of those raised an issue around resourcing and the time and cost of engaging at the subnational level and with lots of different groups within a sector. So that's, I think, no small challenge. And And then finally, in terms of this broader support point, was the highlighted role for Parliament. So linking to the proposition number 10 about that national scrutiny in particular, and the need to engage parliaments, given that they're the ones that are going to be signing off national budgets, and the importance of integrating NDCs and climate change into national budgetary processes. So the second proposition I want to touch on is around MRV, and as I said, this is a more general point around MRV, not just linked to NDC spending, which of course is really important. So what and when? I think quite early on in the session last week, we were thinking about, well, there's already lots of activities in all of these countries around adaptation and mitigation. At what point are they classed as being part of NDC implementation? And then how do you accurately monitor and report on that and avoid double counting? And I think there's still some uncertainty around what additional requirements the Paris Agreement and NDCs add around MRV. So yeah, a lot of that detail is still being worked out. The second point is around data availability. So there has been technical assistance provided to a number of countries around developing out MRV systems, software, training of staff, but generally countries, haven't got good baseline data in place across the board. If there's a national baseline, there's possibly not always a sectoral level baseline, which makes it really difficult then to establish targets that are meaningful and to be able to measure progress against those targets. And the agriculture, forestry and land use sector was one of the ones which really stood out as being a kind of problem area. And for me, that sounds quite significant, given that developing countries are including that sector in a big way for their kind of mitigation commitments. The third point is around access to information. So where there is data, quite often the central coordinating body for NDC implementation isn't the kind of direct reporting line for those sectoral ministries, and sharing of information can often be on a voluntary basis. So, is there a need for more mandates in place to actually, support that sharing of information like we're seeing sort of being established in Kenya with the Climate Change Act? And then the final point on this was that trying to take a step back from MRV and not seeing it just as fulfilling the kind of international reporting requirements, but actually as a system that would support decision making in country. And the fact that this can be such a big thing to get right, so perhaps there's that need to kind of start with what's most needed, what's going to be most helpful for policy and implementation planning, and kind of building up from that over time. So my third sort of comment was around capacity, and as I said, this is a more cross-cutting rather than relating to any particular proposition, but I think at CDKN, if we consider capacity as being about finance, human resources, as well as skills, knowledge, and being able to apply that to deliver change. The conversations last week were around, what capacities are needed to deliver the NDC, and who is it that needs to have those capacities. So there's a feeling that there was that sort of need for reflection and to think about the development of a sort of broad capacity development plan, and including that as part of the first NDC implementation plan. And in particular, there were 3 capacities that were raised. One was around the capacity to coordinate, so that central coordinating function, which is often a new remit for an institution. What are the skills that the people within those units need to have, and what mandates do they need in that central team? The second is around MRV as the central team being able to coordinate that information and then to make sense of it at an aggregate level, and the capacity at the sectoral level to be able to use the tools in a way that they can then collect and provide data in a meaningful way. And then finally, as you might expect, a big capacity need around climate finance, and the propositions talk about national budget allocations, but of course mind was also on access to international climate finance. How do you build capacities around that, and in particular the development of bankable proposals, and how do you do that in a way that has that kind of lasting change within the country and builds the capacity over the longer term.
Claire, thank you very much. Of course, I was about to say, well, would you ask Neil to rewrite these propositions in view of your capacity? But then I remembered you're a co-author. But if you were to rewrite it in view of what you learned last week in Uganda, do you think this capacity issue needs to be drawn out more across the 10 propositions, or do you think it is reflected in the report?
I think it is reflected. However, I think if you use the propositions as a kind of an overall framework, and then another product that we developed, global product, was this kind of planning for NDC implementation quick start guide, and actually using the two together, this goes into much more detail, and it goes into detail on different thematic areas. So I think they're quite complementary.
Well, let me turn now to you, Maggie, and I think I'd just throw another challenge at you. It's called political challenge. And of course, you've lived climate politics quite intensively in Kenya itself because of the process of the climate change bill over a 3-year period, I think we might say. But there was an interesting bit of global politics in relation to climate change just last week. You might have noticed that, at least with respect to climate, the G20 appears to become the G19. Where does that put a country like yours in relation when it, in response from Marrakesh onwards to the US threat and then actual withdrawal from the Paris Agreement? How does that affect the implementation for a country like Kenya? Could you check on that before we go into your response to the propositions?
Sure, thank you. I think in response to your question, ideally the NDCs are nationally determined contributions, and when countries were writing up these commitments, it was really an introspective view. What can we do as a country? What structures do we have in place? What does our national development policy say? What do our sectoral policies say? And while most countries submitted NDC commitments that were subject to international commitment, there was also the domestic allocation of resources that they put forward. And I think, despite the international global changes that we are witnessing, countries remain committed towards implementing the NDCs with domestic resources. I can speak on behalf of Kenya, where we know we have put some budgetary allocation. It's been incremental over the years, but there is budgetary allocation towards, for example, improvement in renewable energy, climate smart agriculture. Those are some of the steps, that are being taken at a sectoral level that can be achieved within the national resources that are available.
That's useful to know. So this framework, you mentioned the resources, but there's the sense of the policy and the institutional components across these 10 lessons. Would you like to sort of draw out some of those that sort of resonate most strongly with you in the context of this report and Kenya?
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. So the 10 propositions are quite relevant to the Kenya context. I think as Neil started off by saying that the proposition should not be looked at as a standard application, but each country should look at them and then see how best, which of the 10 propositions apply best and how to take them forward. For me, the two that stand out quite clearly are that NDC commitments should be consistent with national development plans. As I mentioned earlier, that Kenya does have a national development plan. It's called the Vision 2030, and that is then divided into 5-year medium-term plans. And within those medium-term plans, it's a planning document that looks across the 24 planning sectors and identifies what are the priority actions that each sector should implement. And then it then allocates a budget towards that. And then the MTP, the medium-term plan, medium-term plan is then broken down into annual sector budgets. So we go down from Vision 2030, which is quite a broad view, to the 5-year development plan, down to 1-year annual budgets. And the NDC, when we were preparing the NDC with the government of Kenya, we anchored it in the Vision 2030. We looked at what are the key flagship projects that Kenya wants to achieve. Where do we want to be in terms of, a middle-income economy by the year 2030? And the NDC commitments aimed to achieve some of the aspects of the Vision 2030. More recently, we have been working closely with the government on developing the third medium-term plan. So we did have a first and a second medium-term plan. And now we're going into 2018 to 2022, which will have the third medium-term plan. And that has actually borrowed quite a bit from the National Determined Contribution, so the NDC commitments are feeding into the medium-term plan process. The government has taken a step that we see as quite progressive to, in addition to the 24 planning sectors, they now have climate change as a cross-cutting sector. So the climate change thematic working group is required to look at the medium-term planning process and engage with all the planning sectors and ensure that climate change considerations are given the necessary importance that it requires. And this is a process that has been going on for the last 8 months, and we see it going on until the end of the year, where the successful outcome that we hope to see is that in the medium-term plan 3, climate change will not just be, something that people look at as that's someone else's responsibility, but each sector will now have actions and indicators that they would be able to measure how they're achieving the NDCs and Kenya's long-term climate resilient development pathway. The second proposition that I think stands out as well for the Kenya case is that there's clear institutional leadership. So Kenya, in 2016, Kenya passed the Kenya Climate Change Act, 2016. And as Sam mentioned, it was a long journey towards preparing and signing off on the act. It required a lot of stakeholder consultation, quite a bit of engagement, both at the national and at the county level, and also including private sector, academia, and civil society in the consultation process. But the Act is quite clear in terms of setting out the institutional leadership and ownership that is required for climate change. So it establishes a National Climate Change Council, and this is quite a high-level council, as mentioned by Neil. It's a high-level council that is chaired by the president and has key representation from cabinet. So we have ministries of environment, energy, agriculture, policy and planning, and treasury represented there. And it also has representatives from private sector, civil society, academia, and indigenous peoples. And the role of this council is to ensure that the Climate Change Act is implemented, and that with guidance from the Climate Change Directorate, the council is able to ensure that there's strategic guidance and oversight across all the key sectors. And I think linking with the NDC, because the NDC priority actions cut across Kenya's main economic sectors. So having an institution such as the council will help to ensure that each sector plays its role. Each sector, is aware of what its responsibilities are, and with key guidance from the cabinet secretary sitting on the council, they'll then be able to access the budgets that they require, or access, the capacity that Claire mentioned, the capacity and the resources that are required to ensure that. So for me, those are the two propositions that stand out for Kenya. But to touch briefly on what Neil outlined as what he saw as the challenges going forward, I think he mentioned something around institutional coordination and effectiveness, and effective budget monitoring and reporting. I think as Kenya, there are certain propositions that we're heading towards or trying to ensure that we achieve that will tackle those challenges. So I mentioned that we're currently working with the medium-term plan 3 process. And the next step after this will be to engage at the county level, so at the sub-national level. And this links closely with the proposition number 7, which says NDC institutions respond to local development needs. So when we move down to the county level, in terms of the planning process there, they will borrow largely from what the national plans say, but in writing what we call the county integrated development plans. So there are CIDPs, there are also 5-year plan documents that guide what the counties should do. So in writing those CIDPs, the counties will look at what the national development plans say and try to ensure that the key sectors that stand out for them. So for example, if a county is, a largely agricultural productive zone, or for example, it's a largely tourist attraction zone, then they'll try to ensure that their activities are aligned with the national development plans, which then align with the NDC implementation and achievement of NDC commitments. So we hope to then address that challenge of institutional coordination and effectiveness, particularly at the subnational level. The other step that I see we are progressing with as Kenya is on addressing the challenge of effective budget monitoring and reporting. So as part of the national planning and budgeting process, the National Treasury has recently undertaken a climate public budget expenditure review, and as a result of that has established climate change budget codes. So within the national planning and budgeting process, there will now be a code specific for climate change that will identify adaptation, mitigation, and cross-cutting activities. And each amount of budget allocated both at national level and at county level will have a code allocated to it depending on what activity it seeks to address. And that is currently being rolled out in this financial year that just started in July. And we hope to see in the next few months or towards the end of this financial year, we should start seeing some form of reporting around, this is a budget expenditure that's going towards climate adaptation. We should start be able to compare, these are the counties that are spending some money on adaptation, others are spending money on mitigation activities, others are spending, on cross-cutting and, for example, disaster risk reduction. So those are some of the things that we hope to see in addressing the challenge of effective budget monitoring and reporting. I think in summary, I'd say that the 10 propositions here in this document outline what would be a journey, not necessarily in a stepwise manner, but we do know from what Neil has presented that some countries are more advanced than others in certain areas. So you may have, for example, political ownership is higher in one country than another, or you may have budget monitoring is better in one country than another. But that should not stand out. I believe each country has an opportunity to learn from one another and to know that this is a progressive journey.
Maggie, thank you very much. It's a very kind of clear image of the kind of, very encouraging story that you bring from Kenya. Just one question before we go to South Africa, as it were. You mentioned sectoral engagement. So far, are there particular sectors where there's an enthusiasm and there's a real sort of getting into the weeds of NDC implementation?
Sure. So there are certain sectors in Kenya which have been very clear from the start about their role in terms of achieving the NDC commitments and even just getting Kenya onto on the climate compatible development journey. So we know, for example, the energy sector has been quite progressive with great strides made in renewable energy development. We also know that the agriculture sector has been quite keen, specifically from the adaptation perspective, trying to move towards climate-smart agriculture and, reducing the effects on livelihoods that climate change is causing. Certain other sectors which were fairly new towards this NDC preparation process include industry, bringing on board the private sector and, the manufacturing and industry sectors to understand what role they play in terms of energy, in terms of emissions, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of identifying alternative energy sources. So that's been a new area. Another one is around transport, which has not been very, it hasn't been a key focus to date. But now we're moving towards, for example, the implementation of a sustainable transport policy that will include, efficiency for vehicles and vehicles that reduce, that emit less GHG gases.
Yeah, that's helpful nuance there. Shanaz, South Africa is a very different context, much bigger economy than Kenya, bigger manufacturing base, high levels of emissions. Where does the NDC belong in the complexity of the policy environment in South Africa?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And building on what Maggie said and what Claire said, if I can maybe just give a bit of a background as to how South Africa's NDC came into being and where it's actually sitting. So South Africa's NDC is based on 4 principles. It's mitigation, adaptation, equity, and implementation. And it was guided very strongly by the National Development Plan and by the National Climate Change Response Strategy. So the NDC speaks directly to those two. So it almost makes it easier to implement because the conversation has been ongoing for a long time. And now the NDC has almost just highlighted those two planning processes. Going on, looking at these 10 propositions, I'd like to look at more at where the gap is rather than where it aligns with us. And there's a big gap from when it comes to implementation around the financing of it. So there's a lot of talk about climate finance for implementation, but the reality is that climate finance alone won't be you're not going to be able to implement your adaptation and your mitigation measures. And particularly in South Africa, there's a big so mitigation should be talking to your big emitters, which is your private sector, and in South Africa, it's your big industry. And I think there's a missing in the 10 propositions around how government starts engaging with that. So in South Africa, if you look at the NDC, it talks about the carbon tax and carbon budgets, but that has been an ongoing conversation with industry for a long time. So it's not clear how the NDC is going to move that forward. What is clear is that it needs to be moved forward. There's also, in terms of adaptation, there's a big focus on, Claire was talking about capacity. There's a focus on enhanced capacity and particularly at early warning systems.
Can you go closer to the mic?
Oh, sorry. Apologies. Yeah. I'm sorry about that. So there's a big focus on capacity building and implementation of early warning systems, but that again then links to your National Climate Change Response Strategy. So I think what's quite nice about South Africa's NDC is that it has as a basis existing plans and policies. There is the issue around how this links to sectoral plans and how it links to your local level planning. So at a local level, we have IDPs, which is integrated development plans, that gets rolled out at a provincial level and a local government level, and it talks to how implementation will happen, particularly around addressing equity. So the need to then bring your mitigation and adaptation to that is quite essential, and then also how that then feeds back up into your NDCs. So in terms of the gap, I think there's the mismatch between your national level NDP, your national development plans, and then your sectoral level plans, and then under that with your provincial level, and how that then all feeds back up into your budgeting cycles. Which in South Africa at the moment seems to be the gap. There also doesn't seem to be, in terms of these propositions and what I've seen in South Africa, that there's any strong consultation with National Treasury. So there's the assumption that requests can be made from national departments to Treasury for the finance to implement, but it's not clear that Treasury is included as a stakeholder in all these processes. And it will be, and I think that starting to include Treasury will be quite a shift, but I think a much needed one. So the inclusion of Treasury and then your big emitters. I think those are the two big gaps which,
Thanks.
yeah.
Sure,
which came across.
That's great. And I kind of certainly was struck by this aspect of the sort of foundational issue of equity sitting through the dialogue that South Africa's led. And of course, it's taken that into international processes too, quite fundamentally. That is reflected under your proposition number 7, and probably is a point, probably could be bubbled up quite more strongly.